Can you imagine going to work every day and worrying that you might get arrested for doing your job? Hi everyone, my name is Namrata and I'm a human rights lawyer and activist. If you're new to this channel, the Humane Factor is a space for us to talk about how social issues and policy decisions impact people of the world. Now, one of the many things this pandemic has taught us is that we need to stay informed. During this entire crisis, we've been turning to the media to help us navigate an overwhelming amount of information. Now, freedom of press is so important because a free press can uncover the truth. And we need to know what's going on. You know what happened the last time we weren't informed about what was going on? A global pandemic. Look how that's played out. And we also need to trust the information we read. Now, we can't be informed that there's no evidence of human-to-human transmission of COVID and strut around pretending like everything is normal, when clearly that was not the case. But many entities, including governments, want the truth to stay hidden. Kind of like a 12-year-old kid who doesn't want their mother checking their browser history and announcing it to the entire town. The only difference being, most 12-year-old kids probably wouldn't bully or torture their mothers for doing that. Most. I said most. Of course, there could be exceptions. What do I know about Gen Z kids? Now, in many countries, journalists and media personnel are subjected to way too many risks, including censorship, abuse, harassment, detention, and even death for simply doing their jobs. Can you imagine going to work every day and worrying that you might get arrested for doing your job? That shouldn't be the case unless you're working for the mafia or a drug cartel, where the possibility of arrest is a foreseeable job hazard. Today, I'll be talking about freedom of press and censorship. How has it played out so far? And how is it going to impact us if we don't have access to a free flow of accurate information? Now, a free, independent, and pluralistic media is the core element of any functioning democracy and is necessary for the protection of human rights. We come to know of instances of torture, discrimination, corruption, and other forms of misuse of power only because of the incredible amount of investigative work done by journalists and media personnel. Now, empowering people with facts and accurate information is the first step in ensuring that their rights are protected. Sadly, there have been several instances where journalists and members of the press have been arrested for doing their jobs. In May this year, an Iranian photojournalist and human rights defender, Sohail Arabi, was charged with an offense that he had already been acquitted of. This was the 13th time he appeared before a judge. Now, he had already been serving a 7.5-year prison sentence since 2013 for a Facebook post criticizing the Islamic Republic. Now, in October 2018, he was sentenced to 3 more years for peaceful activism, and this increased his total term to 10 years. Now, earlier in February this year, the Shah Ray prosecutor's office had ordered to acquit him for the charge of propaganda activities against the state. But in a new case against him, he has been charged with the same offense that he was just acquitted of. And why was he charged with this offense? Because he had reported on inhumane conditions in prison and went on a hunger strike to protest against political prisoners who were denied medical treatment. Meanwhile, in Turkey, 4 members of the press were arrested and 24 others were detained in just the first 3 months of 2021, as reported by the Turkish Minute, citing a report released by the Turkish Journalists Association. Now, by the end of March 2021, Turkey's prisons were hosting around 70 journalists. Now, you would think that journalists and media personnel are only arrested for writing something or expressing an opinion, right? Well, guess what? That's not always the case. Journalists don't always have to write something or speak out to be arrested. Sometimes they're arrested for just standing in a public place and doing absolutely nothing. Alexander Budakov is a freelance journalist who regularly reports for DW from Belarus. He was arrested while on an editorial assignment and spent 20 days in detention. Now, he was covering a court trial against an opposition party member and was apparently waiting in front of the courthouse along with other journalists, including an independent reporter, when he was arrested. And what was the charge against him? He was accused of participating in mass riots. Now, the independent reporter, who was also standing in front of the courthouse, was arrested on the same grounds. According to the Belarusian human rights group, May Day, no mass demonstration took place that day in front of the courthouse or anywhere near it for that matter. The evidence against these journalists was the testimony of a single police officer. One man's testimony is all it took to fabricate a whole incident and arrest 2 journalists. So clearly, if you are a journalist, you'd better not stand outside a courthouse with a camera, because to some people that can seem like you are rioting. Since when did cameras become scarier than guns? Speaking to DW after his release, Alexander compared the detention facility to a military prison. He said that they didn't let him sleep. He was woken up twice every night and told to stand in the corridor and strip naked. When he requested the guards to follow the rules of the detention facility, they used force against him. Let's take a look at what he told DW.
Tell us why you were arrested.
Hi. So firstly, I think the authorities don't want journalists to provide alternative information, for example, about the trial of Pavel Severinets and his 6 friends. Information other than official. And secondly, I think this is a revenge for such information. Do you know, it was terrible 20 days and 20 nights. Every day, every night, it was cruel, violent. And do you know, our conditions in Belarus, it's difficult questions, because our condition of journalists are constantly changing. What was safe yesterday is not a prison, as in my case. I just came to watch the trial but spent 20 days in jail.
If this is how someone who's only accused of a crime is treated, I can't imagine how convicted persons are treated. But who knows, perhaps this treatment is exclusively reserved for the likes of journalists and activists, irrespective of whether they actually do or say anything. The mere possibility of them telling people the truth is intimidating enough for those who don't want their dirty secrets exposed. Now, I've spoken about journalists who've been arrested, detained, and held in captivity. If you think it can't get any grimmer than this, I'll tell you that it can. There have been several instances where journalists have been murdered. Recently, a report was published as part of a collaborative initiative by 3 organizations that advocate for independent media: Free Press Unlimited, Reporters Without Borders, and the Committee to Protect Journalists. Now, this report examined an investigation into the murder of a journalist called Zubair Mujahid and ultimately revealed that there were serious errors in police investigation. Now, Zubair Mujahid worked as a correspondent for the Daily Young, Pakistan's largest Urdu language newspaper. Most of its stories exposed corruption and human rights abuses by the local police in a city in Pakistan. Now, this had led to the dismissal of several police officers. He started receiving death threats from many individuals within the police department until finally one day he was murdered. And guess who was tasked with investigating his murder? The very same department from which he had received death threats. How ridiculous is that? This goes against the most basic principle of natural justice that you learn in the first year of law school. No one can be a judge in their own cause. And to date, the killers haven't been punished and are roaming around freely. Now, leading press freedom organizations, including Reporters Without Borders and Free Press Unlimited, are calling for an independent reinvestigation of this case to bring Zubair's killers to justice. Sadly, Zubair wasn't the last journalist to be killed for doing his job and exposing the truth. There have been thousands of them. Take a look at the number of journalists who've been killed since 1992 for just doing their jobs. This list doesn't even include people who've been arrested, detained, prosecuted, or tortured. What can be grimmer than this? Now, aside from harassing and even murdering journalists, there have been censorship attempts by governments to silence them and prohibit them from informing people about facts that are likely to expose them. For instance, a proposed legislation is currently before the Iranian parliament. This legislation, if passed, would ban US and British journalists from entering Iran and likewise ban the Iranian media from reporting what the US and British media publish. Now, according to the bill, these measures are justified because the US and British media have apparently taken many actions against national interests and the Islamic Republic. Now, in its latest report, the global media watchdog Reporters Without Borders concluded that there's a global decline in press freedom. Only 12 countries were deemed to have a good environment for the media. They found that 73% of countries had blocked the media to some degree during the pandemic. Now, when COVID hit us last year, several countries banned individuals and journalists from sharing what they called false or misleading information about the coronavirus. Now, who decides what is false or misleading information? Journalists and media personnel who've done their investigation, or experts in the field, in this case healthcare personnel, or the government and law enforcement? I think the answer here is quite obvious. Ultimately, any information that doesn't align with the official state narrative is deemed to be false or misleading information. Now, these types of draconian laws are golden tickets for the government to censor, detain, arrest, and prosecute anyone who informs people about the things the state doesn't want them to know. If we keep going in this direction, what will happen? What does it mean to not have a free and independent press and access to accurate information? The answer is simple. There would be no democracy. There can be no freedom of thought without the knowledge of reality. Now, if journalists aren't free to report facts, denounce abuses, and inform and alert the public, how would we make informed decisions to elect governments? In many autocratic regimes, the state dominates and wealth is monopolized by a small percentage of individuals. Now, this is mainly because journalists are neutralized and independent reporting is snuffed out. On the other hand, in democracies, entertainment and positive reinforcement will automatically generate political apathy. So we need independent journalism for high-intensity democracy. We need independent watchdogs capable of challenging authority and holding decision makers accountable for their actions. Now, there have been a couple of instances where people have been held accountable for their actions only because they were exposed by the media. For instance, in the immediate aftermath of the Panama Papers revelations, the Prime Minister of Iceland was forced to resign after public protests. The journalist who exposed him, Johannes Christiansen, had been previously honored for his investigations into black market gun trade, sexual abuse of minors, and government corruption. Let's take a look at the clip of an interview where Johannes confronts the former Prime Minister about the interest he held in an offshore company. This interview is what led to his resignation.
Mr. Prime Minister, what can you tell me about a company called Vintris?
Well, it's a... Konan mín seldi hlut í fjölskyldufyrirtækinu, það fór í einhverja umsjón í bankanum og bankin setti upp eitthvað fyrirkomulag á því og úrvarð þetta fyrirtæki eða ég kann ekki einu sinni á þetta allt saman, en allt gefið upp til skatts frá upphafi. Ég meina, þú biður ekki... Já, þú ert að spyrja mig hluti sem ég ekki einu sinni búin að kynna mér. Allt verið gefið upp til skatts frá upphafi. Þannig að þið eru verið að gera eitthvað tortryggilegt sem að ekki tortryggilegt.
Vita félagina í Indefense að þú hafðir átt aflandsfélag sem...
Hvaða atriði ertu að reyna að búa til þetta?
We need more such instances. For that to be possible, we need to allow journalists to do their jobs. Instances of journalists who are harassed for reporting the truth far outnumbers instances of them being able to successfully challenge authority. And even for those journalists, it hasn't been easy. They've had to take on way too many risks and work against all odds. Recently, the United Nations came up with a plan of action for the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. Now, this plan aims to create a free and safe environment for journalists and media workers, both in conflict and non-conflict situations. However, the plan mainly depends on cooperation from countries in terms of developing mechanisms to safeguard and protect journalists. But it's unlikely that this would work, especially in autocratic regimes. Now, if countries have specific agendas that they want to cover up, they are quite unlikely to comply with these international standards. And sadly, it's not always possible to force a country to comply with international regulations. If that were possible, so many countries wouldn't have gotten away with breaching international regulations. And that's why we can't rely solely on cooperation from countries to develop and implement mechanisms for media workers to safely perform their duties. That's only a possible solution, not a realistic one. What we also need is collective action from people, stronger trade and press unions advocating for a free and independent media so as to pressurize decision makers into providing a safe environment for media workers. We need lawyers inside trade unions who would have agreements with public prosecutors. We need to empower journalists and media workers to avail of strong legal resources and support. Ultimately, we need participation from the people. From you. You have the right to demand reliable and accurate information. You have the right to make informed decisions. You have the right to understand who you're voting for. You have the right to independence of thought. This concerns all of us, and that's why we all need to be a part of the movement that advocates for free and independent media. So I hope I've been able to shed some light on what freedom of press means for us. Stay tuned for videos every Wednesday and Saturday on things that we should know and speak more about. Until next time.